Sorry to say, but you are wrong here. Sola Scriptura means by Scripture alone, meaning that we establish faith and practice and doctrine by the Scriptures alone. There's no other source or authority that's infallible to dictate these things. What it doesn't mean is we only use the Bible and nothing else. We discard all scholarship, all history, all tradition, all whatever else you can think of, because all we have is the Bible. That's not what Sola Scriptura means, and has never meant. And this is a thing from the Reformation. And I know in other comments you say you're not a Protestant, whatever you mean by that, because you're not Catholic or Orthodox. But you're holding to Sola Scriptura, which is a very Protestant doctrine and belief, and like one of the founding things of Protestantism from the Reformation. What you're actually suggesting here in your comment is Sola Scriptura or Nuda Scriptura, which means literally Bible alone and zero other sources or authorities that are subordinate to it, which is not a historical position. It is based in a misunderstanding of the Protestant Sola Scriptura rather, because people misunderstand the Latin sola, thinking alone means on its own, not the only authority, which is what the Reformers were talking about, because they were protesting, hence Protestant, and reforming against the Catholic Church, which said the Pope was infallible and the magisterium had infallible interpretive whatever authority to dictate doctrines and dogma. Whereas the Reformers were saying, no, Scripture is the only infallible authority and everything else is subject to it, no matter what it is. Ecumenical councils, creeds, the church, people in the church, all come under the authority of Scripture, because that is the only infallible source. Nothing else is above it. That's what Sola Scriptura means. So we can refer to creeds, councils, church history, church fathers, modern scholarship, ancient scholarship, and say, this is how they interpreted things, how they understood things, these are things they've said we should do, and what scriptures mean. And as long as it agrees with the scripture, we can take that and say, okay, that's fine. We can adhere to that if we want, but we can't bind people's consciences from it. But we can try and convince them and argue that that is what the Bible is pointing to or saying. But as long as it's not contradicting scripture and it's in agreement with it as far as we can understand, then that's fine. That's what Sola Scriptura means. Scripture contains everything we need to understand faith and salvation. And as I think Luther says, or the Reformers, Scripture is the only authority in matters of faith and practice. So that's what we go to the Scriptures for. They're the things they can bind on us. They can establish articles of faith, and no one else, and nothing else. And obviously, in the context of the Reformation, they were against the Pope and his claims to infallible authority and making dogma and all that kind of stuff. So we can go to ecumenical councils, the creeds, the church fathers, and say, this is what they said, this is how the church has understood certain portions of scripture for centuries, millennia even, and say that it is in agreement with scripture and we should probably listen to them, because they, especially more ancient ones, were closer to the time of scripture being written. Some of them were disciples of the apostles themselves, so had that practice and faith and information passed on that they understood and then passed on to their disciples, and so on and so on. So we can take what they say seriously, and we should. But as long as it doesn't contradict what Scripture says clearly, and that they don't bind our conscience to something that's not defined in Scripture, and that salvation is only found in Jesus, as stated in Scripture. And, if you want to go and say nothing but the Bible, that whole, no creed but Christ, which ironically is a creed, but if that's what you want to hold to, then so be it. But you can't claim that is Sola Scriptura, because it's not.